I'm in Black Myth Wukong, and you just see up in the top left of the screen, is that 43 FPS? That is disgusting, guys. Unplayable. We're PC gamers, this is terrible. But what I can tell you, click of the button, we can go from 43, or I guess 34 now, up to 144. And it looks so much smoother. Now, I am recording this at 60 FPS, so you guys can't even see how much smoother the game feels right now. But I assure you, it is so much smoother, and it doesn't feel unresponsive. It feels good. There is some visual artifacts, but it honestly is such a better experience. I'd rather play like this all the time if you are at a lower frame rate, or if you are at a higher frame rate. Like, let's say, for example here, if we drop this down to like the high preset in the game, okay? Even with a higher base frame rate, I still think this is the way to play. The tool is called Lossless Scaling. I've talked about lossless scaling before, but there is new features now. There's been updates, and now there is a ×4 frame generation. So basically now we can just download more frames for our games. You might not even need to upgrade your graphics card when you could just use a tool like this. It works in any game. It looks super good, is super responsive. And I just have a lot to show you here. I've done tons of testing, different GPUs, different frame rates, different everything. Got a lot to show you here. So let's go ahead and jump in right after. So I bet you're wondering, where am I? And how did I get here? And also, how is this camera moving so smooth right now? Well, I'm actually in my dad's office at the moment, and you guys are sitting on FlexiSpot's E7 standing desk. I gave this guy to my dad a few months ago when they first sent it over, and it's been holding up for him every day since. Your best posture is your next posture, and this keeps your body moving. The E7 standing desk is extremely high quality, and FlexiSpot themselves, they offer a 15-year warranty. That's wild. I got the dark bamboo top, which I think just looks absolutely gorgeous, and it's as easy to put together as pretty much an adult Lego set, which comes with the added benefit that almost every part is just so easily replaceable. And guess what? Right now, it's Black Friday, which means great deals on their standing desk, their chair, which I'm sitting in. I use this chair every day for work and everything. Air purifiers. This thing is really good, what the heck? And vacuums and treadmills, FlexiSpot has got it all. So go ahead and check that top link in the description, and let's go ahead and jump right back in. Well, I bet you're wondering what makes this frame generation tool so special. And there's basically two separations of frame generation, at least at the moment. And here you can go to graphics settings and you can turn on frame generation. And this is either with FSR or DLSS if you're on an NVIDIA GPU. Right now I'm on an AMD GPU, and it's only DLSS frame generation that's available in RTX 40 series, which is, not everybody has those cards. Yeah, you could technically go and turn on FSR frame generation here, and you can see that we jumped up from 60 FPS up to 120. And the game does look smoother. It feels smoother, at least to me as well. I think it's honestly quite a good implementation, at least in this game. But we've also seen implementations of FSR frame generation. It's usually been pretty good with DLSS frame generation, but saying like Monster Hunter Wilds that's coming out in February of next year. There's a beta that came out and FSR just looked terrible in that game. And I don't know why. It was just really poorly implemented, at least in the beta version of the game. There's certain times where these built-in ones don't look that good, but they do have some specific advantages where they actually have data from the game. They have motion vectors built into the game. They can take advantage of using certain parts of the game data without giving you as much latency in the game as well. So technically, these are the best way to use frame generations. Technically should be the best tool, but sometimes outside tools can be better because they're integrated into the game. That takes work from developers if they even want to do it in the first place. So you could end up in a situation where the dev just doesn't do it and you don't have access to it in a specific game, even though you say like with NVIDIA's RTX 40 series, you paid for that feature, but a lot of games still don't have it. But on the other side of things, there is also outside software that can do frame generation, just looks at how the game is and tries to interpolate frames between each one. Let's go ahead and turn off the FSR frame generation. And let me go ahead and show you what AMD has been cooking here. Now, NVIDIA doesn't have a driver level frame generation, but AMD does. If you look over at the left side of the screen, this is AMD's driver software. And if you turn on AFMF, or AMD Fluid Motion Frames, you can see that's currently on at the moment. And if I even show their overlay, yeah, you can see that we went from 60 FPS and now we're going to 120. But this type of frame generation has a lot of problems. Like AMD just has a really, really poor implementation here. You might see that the frame rate number goes higher, but the game doesn't feel any smoother to me. This feels exactly like 60 FPS. And also you can see if I move the mouse very quickly, the frame generation completely turns off. You can see that we're going back to like 60 FPS again. I know I'm probably giving you a headache right now. It's because AMD's implementation is so poor. If you move your mouse quickly, they turn it off so that it doesn't look so bad in motion. There isn't any way to change this or anything like that. I've made a full video on AFMF2, but I just don't like this feature. It doesn't look very good, and it turns off when you need it most. When you're moving your mouse, when you need frame generation the most, that's when it turns off. But this lossless scaling is a lot better in terms of image quality, in terms of even latency, because you know, frame generation holds your current frame in the game, and then that takes a past frame as well, and it inserts an interpolated frame in between them. So frame generation inherently always has latency to it. But lossless scaling as a tool here, somehow THS, the developer of it, has just made it not really use that much latency at all. It surprises me so much because I can play a game going from 30 FPS. You can see me playing Wukong here, going from 30 FPS frame generating with ×4 mode with lossless scaling up to ×4, 120 FPS. And I'm beating a boss like this. Like, this shouldn't really feel good. Using frame generation at 30 FPS and go to 120, that's stupid. But somehow it is playable, and I'd rather play with this crazy frame generation than play at a native 30 FPS. I don't know how he did it. This isn't even how he recommends to use it. What THS himself says, the ×4 mode should really be if you have a super high refresh rate monitor, say like a 240 Hertz, or even more than that, 480 Hertz, for example, and you want to max out your refresh rate. You could be starting at 60 FPS, and then you can use frame generation to get to 240. That's a good use of it. It does feel better and look better when you do that. But I'm not gonna lie, somehow even playing 30 FPS to 120 is not terrible. This is a crazy tool. And the reason lossless scaling can be so good here is because this tool does use AI or deep learning within it. It can have one downside of it being a little bit more taxing on your system, but it comes with so many benefits using deep learning that the image quality looks good. You can train the model to get better. It is super, super high quality. And you get all this, and it's only $7. I know you have to pay some money, but at the end of the day, would you rather pay $7 for a program that can enhance your experience so much, that can be used in every game pretty much? Or would you rather upgrade your graphics card for hundreds of dollars? Obviously, this isn't the same as upgrading your graphics card. You get better latency with that and all that. Probably better image quality as well, and not to mention, it is super easy to use. This is starting to sound like an ad, but I just really like the program, all right? This is just genuine. I just like it. First, I want to show you, so in the upper left corner of the screen, you can see a first number, and it says like 73, 72 at times, and then we're going to 144. So the first number is the frame rate that we're starting at, and then the second number is the frame rate that we're ending up at after the frame generation of the game. You can clearly see some artifacts here, like obviously turning the camera and stuff. The monkey guy, you know, in Wukong, he kind of phases in and out of existence. And there is ways to help mitigate this because we're not really using this optimally at the moment. But let's go ahead and just show you the tool for itself. It's a separate application, and you basically apply it to the games that you're playing. And I think it can even activate in other programs as well, not just games. I don't really know when you'd want to use it for that. On the left, we have like scaling, so upscaling and stuff. We will talk about this later in the video, though. I do think the claim to fame feature now is actually the frame generation, but the scaling can be useful for things like emulation. If a game doesn't have built-in upscaling in the game, you can use it and get pretty good results. The latest update to it is Lossless Scaling Frame Generation 2.3. All right, and this has come with more and more improvements. I've seen 2.2, 2.1, and even 2.0 on this, as well as you can do a backwards port to the old one of lossless scaling. Frame generation 1.1 if you really want to, but the new ones do definitely look better. And you can start from just ×2 frame generation all the way up until ×4 now, which is absolutely insane. Because when you think about it, frame generation is just inserting frames between a real frame from the game and another real frame in the game. And if you just put as many frames in between them as you want. You can technically just infinitely keep doing frame generation. Now you can do ×4, which is pretty cool. It does have some downsides, like with image quality and processing power that we will go over later in the video. I do recommend most of the time sticking to the lower ones if possible. Also, there's a performance mode in this. In case the processing power demands ends up being too much, we'll check out some different GPUs later as well, where we can get a little bit more in depth in this, see if different GPUs can handle it. And if we need to use a performance mode, I've also checked the performance versus quality. In terms of this here, if you would like to uncap this, in the top left, we've gone to X2 mode, and it seems to be capping our frame rate at 144 FPS. What you can do is actually turn off that and allow tearing in the game, and that will allow your FPS to go above the monitor refresh rate, because by default, and the best way that this does look is by syncing the frames with the refresh of your monitor so that you don't end up with a bunch of tearing all over the place. To me, this still looks pretty good. You can run into tearing in the game. You might be able to see it on my screen at the moment. I don't see much tearing. It's not bad to turn tearing off. The only thing is, like, well, if your monitor can't show you those frames anyways, there isn't really a point of generating them. So why reduce your latency in the game or have more artifacts for no reason whatsoever? So most of the time I would recommend just leaving it to default, but if for whatever reason you need that, you can do that. You can also see that there's a max frame rate latency. Like if I were to turn this up to 5 frames, the game does get a little bit less responsive, but I don't even really feel it right now. So I turned it up to 5 frame latency instead of 1, and it doesn't feel as bad or anything like that. It's honestly really impressive. You can go ahead and keep it at 1. It's really not that big of a deal. And there's all kinds of other settings depending on what you need for your PC. But this is pretty much the interface here. It's relatively simple to use. And then when you are in a game, for example here, if you want to activate it, you can press Control-Alt-S, and you can see when the HUD comes up in the upper left, then it is on. So Control-Alt-S, and the frame generation is active at the moment. At least that's how I do it. You can change that if you want. You can go to settings here and change your scaling hotkey. And just some tips for using this. In terms of image quality, at least for my opinion, and also latency and that kind of stuff, it's easier for this tool that doesn't have any game data whatsoever. It is really just looking at the frames of the game and trying to make a prediction on what the next frame is going to look like or what the in-between frames are going to look like. So it does have some issues at times. The best way to mitigate that is honestly to cap your frame rate within a game. I recommend, if you can cap it to something, find a frame rate that you can achieve. Say like here, we can cap it to 60 FPS, for example. Now we can get our frame rate at 60 and it'll always be going to 120. Now I find it to be the best responsiveness. Like it actually feels a little bit tighter at 60 FPS here than it did at 70-ish FPS before, which sounds weird, but it does actually work like that. Well, you might run into sometimes to say you press, the button to activate it, and then all of a sudden your screen goes black and you can see that, yeah, something is happening in the top left corner that's trying to activate, but it doesn't work. And then when you turn it off, the game will actually come back. But this is a relatively easy fix, all right? From my experience, only work with borderless window games, which does have some downsides because some games don't necessarily behave very well if you were to change like the base resolution of the game here. For example, in Cyberpunk, if I want to drop the base resolution of the game to like 1080p, well, in borderless window, it looks really weird. It just shrinks it on my desktop, which is hella annoying. But in full screen, it would stretch to the full display. But let's go back up to 1440p and let me just show you that it does work now. Like it works perfectly fine. All right, so let's back out. And then if we just press this, you can see in the top left corner of the screen, we're going from 60 FPS to 120. That's just a tip on if you do run into this at any point. But now let's check out visually how lossless scaling does look, even compared to the ones that are integrated directly into the game. I think we first just check out how much better of an experience it is to play with some artifacts compared to playing at the native frame rate. So say here, we're playing at 60 FPS native on the left, and then we're playing at 120 FPS with the frame generation on the right. At least in like Cyberpunk here in the benchmark, it's not very fast movement or anything like that, but you can see that there's almost no loss in the quality here. I recorded this at 120 FPS, so we can slow this all the way down up to 25%. And you can just see how obviously different this is. It looks pretty damn good. Now, when you are moving slow like that, where you're going to run into problems with lossless scaling frame generation because it's not integrated into the game, the HUD elements. In Horizon Forbidden West, the UI, say the reticle on the screen, the AI can do as good as it possibly can to detect what is a UI element and what doesn't need frame generation, but it's hard to know exactly, and you can still get some artifacts in the motion with this frame generation on because it doesn't know. Whereas DLSS and FSR frame generation, they're integrated directly into the game, which means they can be put in the pipeline before the UI is integrated into it. But honestly, Lossless Scaling is getting really good at hiding these artifacts with the UI elements. It's getting a lot better at detecting things, and honestly, I don't think it looks that bad. And overall, that trade-off of having a game that is so much smoother here, even say 30 FPS on the left side in the game. You're not really supposed to use it here, but we can go ×4 mode up to 120 FPS, which I did record at 120 FPS. And you can see these two compared. I would rather be playing these games with 120 FPS frame generation rather than 30. DLSS, obviously being integrated into the game, it does look better. All right, we're going from 60 FPS to 120 FPS on both sides, especially in motion, like faster motion, like DLSS. There's less artifacts. The biggest thing with lossless scaling frame generation, I think I see, and it does even happen with the integrated ones, is in the corners of the screen, there is, because it doesn't know what the next frame exactly is going to be, it has to kind of make up those edges of the screen, and they can get weird. Like they can get all slurry and odd. I don't know. It feels like the edges of the screen, no matter what, is like kind of blurred, but that isn't always a big deal because you're not really looking at the exact edge of a screen a lot of the time. Another issue with lossless scaling is the character in the middle of the screen can kind of phase in and out of existence. Surprisingly, that's basically the only thing that has major issues, but sometimes, yeah, the character just phases in and out. I don't really know why. Now, if you compare it to FSR frame generation, FSR looks, honestly, a lot of the time pretty similar to DLSS frame generation, as long as it's integrated into the game properly. Lossless scaling doesn't seem that far off. It has the same issues that it does compared against DLSS. FSR doesn't have those issues. The UI doesn't have those problems where it's kind of jumping around and getting jargled everywhere on FSR. And as well, the character isn't phasing out of existence. But one of the downsides with FSR frame generation in particular is how it handles UI elements in the game. I know lossless scaling can make it look all jargled and everything, but sometimes, say like in Horizon Forbidden West here, the UI, say in the bottom right of the screen, is just kind of cut out around the UI in the game. It isn't actually stacked underneath the UI. It is just cutting out the part of the frame and not doing frame generation on that part of the frame. No, I don't think this looks good. It's honestly maybe more distracting. I guess it'd be more distracting to have the UI flickering and stuff. This doesn't really look good either. DLSS handles this the best. That is one thing, as lossless scaling keeps getting better and better with machine learning, which FSR does not have machine learning. It just gets better and better with UI elements on the screen. I think it's super surprising here, at least image quality wise, how close lossless scaling holds up against the big dogs. And it looks so much better than playing the game at the native frame rates that it's kind of like, why wouldn't you use it? It really is super nice, especially too if you have a high refresh rate monitor with the ×4 mode in the game. You can go from 60 to 240. It is wild, and it really doesn't feel bad at all. It feels good, and it makes your game look smoother, genuinely look smoother. Like when you do break it down, you might think I'm bullshitting you here. These are genuinely real frames. Say in Horizon Forbidden West, when we're just kind of spinning around here with the lossless scaling on ×4 mode, you might think that this basically just looks like motion blur at this point, but you're probably looking at Aloy in the middle of the screen right now. And I'm going to show you just a little gotcha. So look at Aloy, and it makes it look like the background is just motion blur. Now go ahead and try to focus on an object as it's going in the distance. Track like a tree. And you're going to see that these are genuinely new frames. It's such a trippy effect, but yes, these are new frames, giving not new information, but making your game look smoother, and it is more detailed that you can actually make out. There is a type of frame generation like AMD's fluid motion frames, AFMF, that does bullshit you on the number. Let's stack it head to head against lossless scaling frame generation, and you just are gonna see the difference. Let's slow this down to 30 FPS. And what's weird is you can get these weird choppy effects with AFMF. Like, what the hell are these things? I don't know. Lossless scaling clearly looks smooth. Obviously, using this AI deep learning thing helps a lot. It doesn't break down, you know, depending how fast you turn the mouse. It is not going to destroy your FPS in the game. Lossless scaling frame generation just keeps getting better. AMD's integrated native driver level frame generation just is basically useless. There's one area with lossless scaling frame generation that just doesn't hold up as well. And it's kind of unfortunate because it's kind of exactly where you'd want to be using lossless scaling frame generation. This does struggle on lower end GPUs because frame generation is not free. Take a toll on your system, especially with lossless scaling frame generation. It uses AI, which is a little bit more overhead like processing and that kind of stuff. Like you just see here in Cyberpunk, with these just uncapped, I'm using the frame rate from the benchmark because it is the base frame rate that the game is getting. AMD fluid motion frames, which doesn't use deep learning, but it does get 164 FPS at its base before frame generation takes place. And lossless scaling at frame generation gets 134 FPS at its base. So you do take a performance hit using the AI scaling on it, and that does suck because you would kind of want that extra performance on your card, and that might push you over the edge. But that is actually why you see here in Wukong, we're kind of sitting here, we're at 49 FPS, obviously. So we're in ×4 mode. And you can see at the top left of the screen, we are going from 40 FPS up to 144 because it's capping my frame rate. All right, we can use lossless scaling frame generation, I mentioned it earlier, in the performance mode. All right, so let's go ahead and click that. I mean, going from 40, 41 up to like 46, I mean, what is that? Like a 10% increase or something in frame rate? That's pretty good. And I did test this on the 7900 XT and the RTX 4070 Ti. As you go up with more frame generation in between, it does take more of a hit on your system, obviously, as you would think. But just in the ×2 mode, you can see that on quality mode, or I guess the base mode for lossless scaling frame generation, it gets 110 FPS from the built-in benchmark. And then on the performance mode, it's getting 118, which is an 11% increase on performance mode, which can save your butt. On ×3, it gets 93 FPS and it goes to 103 FPS. It's a 13% increase. ×4 mode, it got 79, and now it can get 91 on the performance mode. That's a 15% increase. NVIDIA versus AMD, at least with lossless scaling frame generation, at least the 7000 series one that I tested here, responds a lot better to this program than the NVIDIA one does. Because say for example, on the ×4 mode, the NVIDIA 4070 Ti Super got 79 FPS base, and the 7900 XT got 100 FPS base. Crazy, even though the 4070 Ti Super costs more. In terms of performance, they're typically pretty similar. So AMD's cards do typically respond better to this frame generation. Now in terms of the ×2 mode, we got 134 FPS on quality up to 152 with the performance. That's a 13% increase. On ×3, it's 113 FPS versus 140, which is a 24% increase. That's pretty crazy. And then 100 FPS on the ×4 mode quality against 129 FPS on the performance mode. That's a 29% increase. It's pretty nuts, honestly. You can get quite a bit more performance going to the performance mode. You might have noticed in these tests that it doesn't really look that different compared to the quality mode and the performance mode on lossless scaling frame generation. You kind of are right. Honestly, the frame pacing feels good between them, like it's not chugging along that much, which you might think it would give up on that a little bit. I mean, there's the same artifacts, like the edges of the screen are kind of blurred. The character does phase in and out of existence in the middle of the screen sometimes. Where is the difference between them? Because they really do look similar, but you're just getting more performance on the right here. And where I mostly notice a difference in this, I'm hoping I am actually seeing this properly. At lower frame rates, say like 30 FPS on the performance one, doesn't seem to pace the frames as well compared to the quality version of it. So as you go down in frame rate, the performance mode does struggle more and more. An added benefit to that, because you're on performance mode, you do have a higher base frame rate. It might not matter as much. And with all the performance mode and the actual visual quality of the frame generation, let's go ahead and check out the latency of it, because it seriously is good. So what I did is I clicked my mouse and just, saw how long it took between the shot fired in the game and the actual mouse click. Now, I can only shoot my camera at 120 FPS, so it isn't exactly the highest speed camera ever, but I don't really have another option, unfortunately. And first up, let's see 60 FPS native on the left versus 120 FPS, with ×2 frame generation on the right. And you can see that there's a tiny bit of a difference with the click and then the response. It's not crazy. And that's kind of what I feel in these games. It just does not feel bad at all. And compared to even the built-in ones, which have an advantage of being lower latency because they have access to game data, they're not really that much better. And with all that said, I've been glazing this program so much that it's such a great tool. How do you get it to run on your GPUs? And I have a ton of GPUs here I can test. So let's see how it feels, how it can improve your performance on maybe lower end GPUs. I just threw the RX 6600 in there. I just threw it in there very aggressively. We're gonna check that out once this loads. I'm a little bit scared because it's not really loading on the previous settings. We're in, boys. All right, let's change this back to what would be reasonable. So on this GPU, you're probably looking not cinematic quality, but more like medium in this game. And let's see what kind of FPS we can achieve just at native 1080p here. That's kind of the problem with this is, well, how do we use frame generation at this point? Because we're already at a low frame rate, but we can go ahead and try it. My dog's barking upstairs, by the way, if you can hear that. The frame generation, and it seems like we were at like 46 FPS and now we're at like 38 base and we're going up to 76. Now I will say this feels laggy. And I wouldn't really recommend playing like this. And using FSR upscaling at native gets us to like the low 50s in the same area. So it's not terrible, but let's just try the low preset and see if we can achieve 60 FPS. And yes, this takes a huge hit to the visuals because of the shadows and the global illumination, but this is at least playable at low settings here. So let's go high textures, the shadows up to high as well. Over here in the high 50s, which isn't terrible. Let's try FSR on quality, 67% at 1080p here. And now we can achieve this. Now let's go ahead and turn on lossless scaling because this can improve our experience. It takes a huge hit to FPS. Do you see that? We were at like 70 and now we're at like 50. I was hoping that we'd be able to achieve, that does feel pretty good actually. It really doesn't feel that bad. It doesn't feel terrible, and I will say it looks like 100 FPS. We can try to make up for that a little bit, and let's go ahead and turn on the performance mode of this. The low to mid 50s, somewhere in there. That's a lot more achievable a lot of the time. I would recommend capping your frame rate to 60. What happens if we can turn on like X3 mode? And now it's capping at 144. I don't exactly know why. And there's tearing. You guys can see that, right? Unless that's, whoa, that's weird. I think you can see that. That looks really weird. I don't know what's happening. It doesn't really look like tearing, but it doesn't look like, what the hell? Okay, now I threw in the 6700 even more aggressively. And this is basically the same GPU that's in the PS5, not the PS5 Pro, but the PS5. We're at 1080p, low settings, but has like the shadows on high and the textures on high to make the game look a little bit more decent. And you can see that we're achieving like over 70 FPS, and we might be able to do quite a bit more now. Make it the quality version of it, and let's check that out. When the game kind of went black for a second, it usually does the first time you try it. We are getting about 53 FPS going to 100 FPS, which is pretty nice, okay? And then when we get it over here and stuff, then things get just better, all right? Now, if we want to achieve a little bit more, let's go ahead and try the performance one. Again, unless you have a lot of extra headroom to play with, usually the performance one might be the way to go, honestly. Now we can get over 60 FPS pretty consistently, and over in the most demanding part, we're still getting above a 60 FPS, except it just hit 57. So it's pretty good though. That gives you the opportunity to now to just go ahead and cap your frame rate at 60, so you get a nice consistent frame rate, frame generation experience. And now you're getting 60 to 120. It feels great right now. Actually, it feels great. Let's go ahead and I just want to try one thing. Is this GPU fast enough to achieve this at 1440p? We're gonna have to use some upscaling. We got a 1440p native here, the 40s FPS at 1440p instead. And what we can go ahead and do in order to compensate for that is even at 1440p, let's go ahead and turn it down to quality upscaling, which would be 67%. And you can see that we can achieve 60 FPS to like 120, even at 1440p. Now, I'm not gonna lie, this feels freaking good. This allows you to play at a much higher frame rate on a GPU that typically wouldn't be capable of this. What happens if we go up to like ×3 mode? Now, I think it's gonna have a weird issue. I'm at 240 hertz, but I don't know, it keeps capping it at 144. So let's just go ahead and allow tearing to let it kind of go past. So we're going from like 50-ish, mid 50s to 160 FPS. To me, I don't feel like it's that worth it in a game like this. Now, that's something to point out too. As with frame generation on anything really, you don't really want to use frame generation in competitive games because it gives you higher latency. It doesn't really help your competitiveness in games. Though in solo games, like unless you really need to achieve like a really high refresh rate on your monitor, usually going up to 120 FPS from 60 or something like that is honestly gonna be quite good. What if you just use FSR frame generation? And let's go ahead and see what happens. So we're locked at 60 FPS right now. Let's go ahead and just turn on FSR frame generation. We're at 1440p on quality. We're up to 120 FPS. I will say it feels better using FSR frame gen. I think this is honestly, yeah, it's better on FSR. I would prefer to use it like this. And it does help that FSR can handle dips in frame rate, like not a lock 60 FPS, it can handle that better. So that definitely helps on this GPU. I would play just like this. Like, let's go ahead and turn on global illumination. Maybe go up a little bit more on texture detail. We can still achieve like 120 FPS. Yeah, I would prefer to play the game like this. The hit to performance for lossless scaling here isn't really worth it in this case. And you can see the game looks quite a bit better with the settings turned up a little bit. Like, I'm not going to be sitting here like super biased or something like that. I really like lossless scaling for generation because it's really versatile and it does look possibly better than FSR in some games. But you can see, at least in Wukong here, even on this GPU, well, right here, our FPS is dipping lower. We can't achieve 120 with the FSR frame gen. But it does look good. Okay, like it looks good, it feels good. I honestly think this feels pretty decent. It's a little laggy, but nothing I would be unable to play with or anything like that. I'm going to try the RTX 4060 because it's the lowest NVIDIA GPU that I have and see if it's worth playing with. The 4060 is in here now. We're at 1080p on medium settings, and you can see, wow, we're only achieving 55 FPS. That is depressing. Let's go ahead and mess with some stuff to see what we can get running here. Let's go ahead and just set DLSS to quality, which is 67%. And you can see now we're at like 80 or 70 FPS or so, which isn't really bad. Honestly, this feels really, really quite good. Now let's cap it at 60. And now we can hit lossless scaling and we should be able to achieve, oh man. So we're still hitting like the 50s FPS going up to 100, unfortunately, which does feel kind of bad. If we use DLSS frame generation instead, so right here we can enable this because we're on a 40 series graphics card, and can we get 120 FPS? If we show this, and no, we don't. 1 second, this is bugging out. DLSS does this. I hate that DLSS does this. Okay, we'll cap it at 120. Can we achieve? No, we can't. So actually we're achieving greater FPS using lossless scaling frame generation. It feels like pretty snappy, I will say. This is very playable. Maybe not ideal, but it's playable. Oh, well, we're at 1440p. That's actually why. That makes a lot more sense. This whole time we've been at 1440p. But yeah, we could technically decrease our DLSS down to like what would be balanced, so around like 57%. And with this and then frame generation using DLSS, we can achieve pretty decent results here. Or we can go back in here and then turn off. We can technically achieve higher frame rates using lossless scaling frame gen than using DLSS frame gen. The inbuilt solution from NVIDIA. You buy this 40 series graphics card technically for that. That just kind of gets me with lossless scaling frame generation. I mean, this thing This program that is also capable of scaling as well, which does also look quite good, for $7, in some ways mitigate an entire upgrade to your GPU. And it feels really good. I don't know how playing at 30 FPS going to 120 FPS feels good using FrameGen, but it honestly feels pretty good. And what does suck is even though it can give you a lot more frame rate, it does come at a performance cost because frame generation isn't free, even though it's getting close to free. Sometimes lower end GPUs, it's pretty hard to take advantage of it because it pushes your base frame rate too far down to be what would be enjoyable. In that case, you might still have to upgrade your GPU. The artifacts can be a little sucky, and because it's not built into the game, it does have UI artifacts where it looks gargled, good. I don't know. What is it? Where everything looks mixed up and it's jumping around. I mean, that happens with this, and the AI algorithm is getting better and better, and I've seen it progress better and better. I really do like it, and I highly recommend it. It's super cheap, super affordable. Definitely something at least to buy and tinker around with and see if you like it in certain games, because I really do enjoy it. I do have access to very fast graphics cards, so I don't find myself using it that often, but when it's there, it's there. And it can provide frame generation or upscaling in games that don't have them to start, or you can use that frame generation to achieve much higher frame rates, like ×3, ×4 frame generation. And this ×4 is pretty damn cool. It might not be that useful all the time, especially with the performance it has been it for me though. Go ahead and check out FlexiSpot down below. They're doing their Black Friday sale, so I use their stuff quite a bit. I actually like their new air purifier they sent me, so it's been pretty neat. But go ahead and also check out Lossless Scaling frame generation in the description if you wanna take a look at that. I think it's pretty dope. So y'all have a good one, and I'm gonna see you in the next video. Peace.